Chris Nilan is one of the most prolific NHL enforcers of all time, beloved by both teammates and fans. The right winger is known for not only being one of the most effective fighters in the game, but also for his reputation as an outstanding teammate and for his offensive contribution on the ice, something that most enforcers lack. Chris Nilan's road to success was a tough one. From growing up in the tough neighborhood of Boston and scrapping on the streets to his unlikely career in the NHL and his struggles with addiction, Chris Nilan fought for every inch to make his hockey dreams come true. Chris's story is one of resilience, grit, and inspiration, and his notorious on-ice presence has made him a favorite among hockey fans. Players knew him to never back down from a fight, no matter how big the opponent, and during his time in the NHL, he sat in the penalty box for over 3,000 minutes. Let's take a closer look at the story of Chris the Knuckles Nilan, and how this kid from Boston became one of the most legendary fighters in the game. Chris was born on February 9, 1958 in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston with a large Irish-American population. As an Irish-American kid growing up in the neighborhood, Chris Nilan was no stranger to a fight. Chris recalls getting in fights every weekend and living in a neighborhood where backing down was not an option if you wanted respect. He was known amongst friends to stick up for those who needed help, a trait that would make him a valued and respected teammate during his time in the NHL. Chris had a hard youth, but hockey was his saving grace. Growing up in Boston in the 60s and 70s, Chris loved to watch the Big Bad Bruin. He idolized players like Bobby Orr, Ken Hodge, Derek Sanderson, and Wayne Cashman, and his love for the game ignited a dream to one day play in the NHL for the Boston Bruins. Hockey served as a refuge and an outlet for Nilan. According to his mother, he would sneak into the local hockey arena after hours and spend time practicing alone late into the night. Chris had very ambitious goals as a young kid from Boston, but just where did he get his start in hockey, and how did he eventually reach his aspirations? Chris Nilan started playing hockey in the Greater Boston Youth Hockey League. He eventually went on to play in the NCAA hockey for the Northeastern University Huskies. He played a tough game, even in his earlier days, but he just wasn't very interested in being an enforcer. He wanted to play hard, check hard, and contribute offensively, but fighting wasn't part of his playbook. However, Chris wasn't on the radar of any NHL team, and most teams considered him as a long shot to get drafted. Nonetheless, Chris had confidence that he could make it, and eventually would have his dream of playing in the NHL realized. But who would draft this subpar player from Boston that nobody has heard of? It was the Montreal Canadiens that drafted Chris in the 19th round of the 1978 NHL draft. Out of 235 players, he was drafted 231st. And while Chris was ecstatic to be part of a legendary NHL club like the Canadiens, it was clear he'd still have to fight his way onto the lineup. In the 70s, teams like the Philadelphia Broad Street Bullies and the Boston Big Bad Bruins took the NHL to a new level. These teams brought a physical presence to the game like never seen before. The likes of tough guys like Dave Schultz and Terry O'Reilly. Other teams knew they were in for a beating when they matched up. The intimidation strategy proved to be a good one, because in the 1973-74 season, the Boston Bruins and Philadelphia Flyers faced off for the Stanley Cup. This proved that grit, aggressive playing, and intimidation paid off in the NHL. And so every team in the NHL began putting gritty players and enforcers in their lineup. Fighters were becoming more common in the NHL, and it wasn't hockey unless someone was getting a beating. This opened up a golden opportunity for Nilan, even if he didn't know it at the time. Chris started playing for the Nova Scotia Voyageurs, an AHL farm team for the Montreal Canadiens. His upbringing in West Roxbury and his never-back-down attitude would turn him into a feared enforcer in the league. In 1979, during one of his first games, Chris made a name for himself in the AHL when he took out one of the AHL's top enforcers, Glenn Cochran. He gave a beating to Cochran, earning him the reputation as a fighter. It was never his intention to be a fighter in the league, but it was clear that he had the gift to throw punches to protect his teammates. He knew that this could be his ticket to the NHL, and he didn't hesitate to take on the role of enforcer. He racked up a total of 304 penalty minutes in just 49 games with the Voyageurs. Chris's fighting presence on the ice quickly got the attention of the Montreal Canadiens. Fighting on the AHL was one thing, but could Nilan hold his own against the NHL's toughest enforcers? The answer is yes. Throughout his career, Chris Nilan racked up over 3,000 penalty minutes and established himself as one of the most dominant enforcers ever to play the game. On top of his ability to fight, Chris was also an effective player, something most enforcers lacked. He has hard work ethic, loyalty to his teammates, and willingness to fight for the good of them made him a favorite among fans and teammates. His accomplishments are well known, but how did Chris Nilan go from the 231st overall draft pick to one of the most prolific fighters in the league? Chris made his NHL debut with the Montreal Canadiens in 1980. While his goal wasn't to make it to the NHL as an enforcer, it was clear that this is what the Canadiens wanted. The Montreal management wanted a tough guy who would stick up for his teammates and let the goal scorers of the team like Guy Lafleur do their job. Chris Nilan didn't see himself as just an enforcer, but he knew filling the role was his only way to stay in the league, and so Chris the Knuckles Nilan was born. In the 1980-81 season, Nilan played 57 games, putting up 7 goals, 8 assists, and 262 penalty minutes. The right winger was playing an aggressive style of hockey, he checked hard, and he could score from time to time. He didn't hesitate to take on the league's toughest fighters like Harry O'Reilly and Stan Jonathan. At 6 feet and 200 pounds, Knuckles wasn't a big player, but he had no problem beating the top fighters in the league, and he was a player that many feared. Chris knew that fighting wasn't his only strength, but it surprised many that he could also put the puck in the net. Amongst his teammates, Chris was known for his dedication to the team and hard work on and off the ice. Teammates respected him for his team-first mentality and his toughness or skills as a forward. Knuckles always stuck up for his teammates, and while his opponents may not have liked it, his teammates were very grateful to have him on the ice. Chris Nilan's early years as a Canadian was respectable, but it took some time until he really found his stride in the NHL. After playing several years for the Montreal Canadiens, Nilan's offensive capabilities became more clear. During the 83-84 season, the right winger would score 16 goals and have 10 assists in 76 games. And the next 2 seasons, he would put up very similar numbers. His best season was in 85-86 with 19 goals and 15 assists in 77 games. From 83 to 86, Nilan would spend 970 minutes in the penalty box. Nilan's offensive contributions gave him an edge. Having a player that could fight well and be an offensive threat was a real asset for the Canadiens. Not to mention Chris's positive presence in the locker room. All this helped him stay in the league for 13 seasons. Against all odds, Chris Nilan made it to the NHL, and he was an effective player and popular in Montreal. The fact that he made it to the Canadiens lineup was a great achievement for him, but there was a larger achievement waiting for him. Every kid that dreams of playing in the NHL dreams of winning the Stanley Cup. In 1986, this dream would become a reality for Chris Nilan. Nilan was a crucial part of the 86 Canadian Stanley Cup team, recording over 30 points in the regular season and keeping his role as a feared enforcer. During the playoffs, Nilan would play 18 games with 3 points and 141 penalty minutes. With a stacked team, including players like Mats Naslund, Claude Lemieux, and Patrick Waugh, the 1986 Montreal Canadiens would go on to beat the Calgary Flames in Game 5 of the Stanley Cup Finals. With that, Chris Nilan would make the history books with the Canadiens. According to Nilan, he loved to play for the Canadiens and have the opportunity to be part of such a team with rich history and dedicated fans. But what was Nilan's future with the franchise he loved so much? In 1988, Chris Nilan's time with the Montreal Canadiens came to an end. According to Chris, he had some tense exchanges with head coach Jean Perron, and this led to the team trading him. The franchise traded Nilan to the New York Rangers in exchange for the first-round draft pick in the 1989 draft. Chris was loyal to the Canadiens, and in his own words, he was never the same after the trade to the Rangers. But Chris was used to fighting for his career, and he wasn't going to stop in New York. In the 88-89 season, he played 38 games for New York, pulling 7 goals and 7 assists. Coming into the 89-90 season, Chris was 31 years old. He was well past his prime, and he managed to play another 25 games where he scored a goal and 2 assists. Nilan was still a feared enforcer in the league, but would his declining offensive strength mean that this was it for him in the NHL? With his future in the NHL still uncertain, In 1990, Chris got an opportunity he had always dreamed of, playing on the Boston Bruins. In his first season wearing the Bruins jersey and playing under head coach Mike Milbury, he played 41 games, racking up 6 goals, 9 assists, and 277 penalty minutes. Decent numbers compared to his previous season in New York. In 1991, in a game against the Hartford Whalers, Chris would make it into the record books. He racked up a total of 10 penalties for a record of 42 penalty minutes, solidifying his reputation as one of the toughest players the NHL has ever seen. Playing for the big bad Bruins was something Chris dreamt about as a kid, but for him, playing in the Boston Gardens was never the same as playing in the Montreal Forum. According to Chris, winning the Stanley Cup with Montreal tops it all. Chris Nilan would go on to play 80 games with Boston, totaling 25 points and 463 penalty minutes before he was placed on waivers in 1992. With time against him, what was next for Knuckles? With his career nearing its end, Nilan would get the last chance to play for one more team that defined his career, the Montreal Canadiens. While his final stint with the Canadiens was short, just 17 games, he could wear the Habs jersey one final time before hanging up his skates, and the Canadian fans got a chance to say goodbye to a truly beloved player of the franchise. As a Montreal Canadien, Chris Nilan played 523 games with 88 goals and 87 assists, and 2,248 penalty minutes. His crucial role as an enforcer and his offensive skill helped the franchise win the Stanley Cup in '86 and made him a legend in Montreal. Like many enforcers, life after hockey wasn't an easy adjustment for Nilan. While Chris Knuckles Nilan was dishing out punches to heavyweight fighters in the league, he was taking a lot of blows too. How did this physically affect him when he quit the game? After retirement, Chris needed some surgery to repair the damage done to his body, but the pain medication doctors gave him was too difficult to quit, and Chris developed an addiction. The addiction was so strong that he could no longer get prescriptions for the pain pills. He resorted to using heroin. On top of his addiction pills, Chris also struggled with alcohol abuse after retiring from hockey. Some people with addictions as serious as this just never managed to break free. Chris was in a downward spiral, and ending his addiction was incredibly difficult. But the fighter that he is, Knuckles took these problems head on. He eventually went to rehab, and in Hawaii with his now girlfriend Jamie Holtz, he was able to come out on top. Today, Chris Nilan lives in Montreal, close to the fans and the team he loved playing for. According to Chris, life is great. He runs a podcast called Raw Knuckles, where he talks about his career in the NHL and anything hockey. And while Chris Nilan has a more peaceful life now, it doesn't mean he stopped fighting. He works with the Liam Foundation, which was created to help the sons of Chris's friend who had a rare mitochondrial disease. The foundation raises money to help find a cure. Chris, the Knuckles Nilan, will go down in NHL history and will always be a part of the rich tradition of the Montreal Canadiens. He is known for his readiness to drop the gloves with anyone and his offensive skill, but he is also known for his strong work ethic, his genuine personality, and for always sticking up for his teammates. With the NHL slowly eliminating fighting from the game, the likes of Chris Knuckles Nilan will never be seen again, making Chris Nilan a true hockey legend.